Hi everyone, welcome to a new video. If you're new to my channel, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rita. I'm an academic in British literature, and about a year ago I started this channel in the hopes of encouraging people to read and also to hopefully introduce you to your next favorite book. If you saw my last video, then you know that I'm in a little bit of a journey to find my favorite reimagining of Austen's novels. And this week I have a new chapter on Mary Bennet's adventures. In my last video, I talked to you about Mary's time-traveling adventures in Jennifer Duke's Back to the Bonnet, and this time I have with me a very different book focusing on Mary. It's Janice Hadlow's The Other Bennet Sister. Now, this is a fairly large book. It's almost 700 pages long, but don't be intimidated. It's incredibly readable. And I don't know about you, but where I live, the weather recently has been pretty dismal. So just sitting on the couch with a cup of tea and chocolate and just listening to the rain hitting my window pane as I read this book has been exactly what I needed. So this book was kindly sent to me by Pan Books, and I am so grateful for them for doing that. I absolutely loved reading this book. It really does the original justice by giving us so many insights into Mary's mind and upbringing and showing us how she became the person that we meet in the original, but also how this same person can, through a series of events, gain confidence and self-esteem and eventually fulfill her true potential. Now, the first pages of the book introduce us to a Mary that, because of her physical appearance, has been treated differently from her sisters. And this is something that we know from the original. Whereas her sisters are all praised for being beauties, Jane especially, Mary is the plain one, the one who decides to dedicate herself to accomplishments such as reading and playing the piano because she's not going to be able to distinguish herself from her sisters in any other way. And I really liked Janice Hadlow's explanation as to why Mary grew up to be so serious and so different from her sisters. She thought that if she were lighthearted, always running around like her sisters do, she would look ridiculous, and so she would be made fun of. And of course, this backfires massively because she decides to then put on this very serious persona, but it's precisely this pomposity that makes her appear so ridiculous to the other characters and consequently to the reader as well. But with this in mind, Mary starts reading conduct books, which were books aimed to educate the reader on social norms. And many of these were actually targeted especially at women. Now, by the time Austen was writing Pride and Prejudice, there was already a huge market for these books targeted specifically at this part of the population. And now, not all conduct books were super conservative, tedious affairs, even though many of them were. Austen hated them generally, but even she enjoyed some of them, and she was definitely very aware of the dialogues that were contained in them. And so in her novels, she refers to these kinds of ideas many, many times. And Janice Hadlow's explanation as to why Mary is attracted to such a dry, potentially boring genre of literature is really great. She shows that she has very low self-esteem and very little trust in her ability to behave properly in society. And so she hopes that these books will help her how to do it, which makes perfect sense. And in these books, she finds solace because in many ways they are arguing the precise opposite that she has been told all her life, particularly by her mother. Conduct books were very critical of what they saw as the excessive focus society placed on women's physical appearance, and the idea that society harms women by objectifying them and reducing their worth to their beauty is an idea that pretty much all conduct books shared, even if their political ideas differed massively. And this is a harm that Mary has experienced personally. So she feels this very deeply. So all of this makes you immediately sympathize with Mary. And it's really easy to see why anyone who enjoys reading would feel this way towards this character. And Austen doesn't mock Mary's thirst for knowledge or the fact that she reads a great deal. At no point is she mocking this. She mocks the fact that she has no critical thinking, that she accepts what she reads as fact without wondering what the agenda of the writer could be, why they are putting these ideas forward, why they want the reader to behave in such a way, especially when the reader is a woman. And so Austen mocks her for reading these conservative conduct books with moral maxims that she repeats without really understanding and which are shown to have no real application to a real person's everyday life. But if you enjoy reading, then the simple fact that the character in Pride and Prejudice who reads the most is routinely mocked will probably get you to sympathize with Mary anyway. And as Carrie Bradshaw would say, we cannot help but wonder, what kind of a person is Mary like? Well, in this book, she is definitely serious, but she has her funny moments. So, for example, she smiles at the prospect of making her mother angry, such as by being the sister who actually manages to marry Mr. Collins, and so becoming the daughter that makes it possible for Mrs. Bennet to keep her house. And she writes, "It was a triumph that would offend Mrs. Bennet very deeply. That alone rendered the prospect of marrying Mr. Collins almost worthwhile." So she also has this kind of satisfaction in annoying her mother, which I thought was absolutely amazing. And Janice Hadlow shows us how difficult it can be for someone like Mary to live in a society where, as a woman, she is judged based on her appearance. Now, while sadly, absolutely none of this has changed to our day, Mary is under even more pressure because she is expected to get married. So when we have a plot point where Mrs. Bennet is beside herself because Mary needs glasses, she needs to wear them if she is to read properly, and she doesn't want her to wear them because it will make her uglier and therefore less attractive to potential suitors, or so Mrs. Bennet thinks, this absolutely rings true. This is absolutely the kind of objection that someone like Mrs. Bennet would come up with. And like in Jennifer Duke's Back to the Bonnet, which I looked at in my previous video, this author points out the similarities between Mary and Charlotte Lucas, even though in the end their relationship is very different from one book to another, so they develop very differently. But both of these women are what in Austen's time would have been called plain, and they don't have a large dowry with which they can tempt potential suitors. So they have to make a decision. Do they marry someone they don't love if they are lucky enough to be asked? Or do they accept a life of reduced circumstances as single women? And this Mary is a very traditional one who is genuinely terrified of the prospect of becoming an impoverished single woman, and for that we can't really blame her. So this book follows, for the first third, the same timeline as the original, and then the rest happens about 2 years later after Mr. Bennet dies. And so we follow Mary as she hops from one house to the next, struggling to feel at home anywhere, much like Austen and her sister Cassandra did when they were moving around after the death of their father, until they were finally given the cottage in Chawton by their brother Edward. And so this book shows how a woman in this situation can easily become a target for bullying and can constantly feel herself to be a burden for her family. And there are two possible solutions for this. One is marriage and the other one is work. And this Mary immediately rejects the possibility of work. So she immediately rejects the possibility of becoming a governess And again, we can't really blame her. So if you have read anything by Anne Bronte, who wrote about her experiences as a governess a little bit later after Pride and Prejudice, then you will understand why. We can't really blame her for not thinking that this is a great solution to her problem. But instead, Mary longs for the traditional life as a wife and mother, and she feels that she is never going to be happy until she achieves these. And I have to say at this point that I was a little bit disappointed that all the other characters corroborated the idea that this is the only way for a woman in this period to achieve happiness, and that no one challenged the idea that life for a single woman will inevitably be an unhappy one. And while it's understandable that Mary equates having a settled home with marriage, I desperately wanted one of the characters to show her that there is an alternative, possibly a harder, more precarious alternative, but still an alternative. But regardless of this, it was fun to read what happens to Mary as she finds herself in London and in a love triangle with someone who, in his best moments, I would say has the humour of Henry Tilney, and in his worst ones has the stubbornness of an Edward Bertram from Mansfield Park, and also with someone who will definitely give you Henry Crawford flashbacks. So these are the two competitors for Mary's heart. And I really loved the last few paragraphs. I thought that they wrapped Mary's story really, really well. So I have no doubt that the readers will really enjoy that as well. So I highly recommend this book. It's written in a really lovely style, and it was such a treat to read. And you can buy it below in the link that I'm going to leave in the description. And let me know what you thought of it when you read it. Please drop me a comment below letting me know what you thought. And if you have any other suggestions for reimaginings of Austen's novels that you think I should read, then please leave me a comment below as well. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my future Austen-related content. And until then, stay well and keep reading.